"I promised, Mother. Neither the ice nor the 1,000 wolves nor death will stop me." The wind cut Amaya's face, each gust a blow of 1,000 blades on her already battered skin. Before her, the 5,000-kilo colossus of muscle and fury snorted, exhaling vapor that froze in the air, while the sinister howl of a pack of hungry 1,000 wolves echoed from the shadows, closing in. Below her, the frozen river groaned, cracks spreading like deadly spiderwebs. Her son, her village, the solemn promise to her dying mother. Everything depended on her. With her deceased husband's spear heavy in her trembling hands, Amaya knew this would be her last stand. But what she didn't know was the true price of that frozen promise. Amaya pressed her lips together, feeling the intense cold burn her nostrils with each breath. Her eyes, once teary from the memory of her mother, now gleamed with fierce determination, sweeping across the desolate landscape around her. The buffalo, a mountain of fur and fury, stomped its front hoof on the ice, a hollow sound that reverberated in her chest, while the mist of its warm breath mingled with the frigid air. It was a magnificent and terrifying creature, and the hunger that drove it was as palpable as her own. Behind, the wolves' gleaming eyes formed a relentless semicircle, each pair a point of threat in the gloom of the blizzard, which, for a brief moment, seemed to lessen, revealing more of the vast, unforgiving white expanse. Her husband's spear, heavy and cold in her hands, was more than a weapon. It was a link to the past, a silent reminder of all she had lost and all she still had to protect. She could feel the vibration of the ice beneath her fur boots, a constant lament warning her of the fragility of her support. A small, almost invisible crack stretched from the buffalo's hoof towards her, like a treacherous invitation to the abyss. It wasn't brute force that would save her, but the cunning her mother, a woman of few words but deep wisdom, had taught her since childhood. "The ice is a mirror, Amaya," she used to say. "It reflects the truth of those who tread upon it. But it can also be a trap for those who don't respect it." Amaya closed her eyes for an instant, seeking the calm her mother always found, even in the worst storms. She visualized her son's face. Small and hungry, the village elders, their faces wrinkled by age and worry. The promise was not just a word, it was the life of her people. She opened her eyes, and the hesitation had vanished, replaced by an icy clarity. The buffalo was too large to be faced directly, the wolves too numerous to be fought one by one. But the ice was the battlefield, and it had its own rules. With an almost imperceptible movement, Amaya took a step to the right, testing the surface. The buffalo grunted, turning its massive head towards her, its eyes red with fury. The wolves, hungry and patient, tightened their circle slightly, their howls low and guttural. She needed space, time, an opening. Her mind worked quickly, calculating the distance, the thickness of the ice, the wind's direction. She remembered how her father, on a winter hunt, had used the terrain to his advantage, turning a disadvantage into an opportunity. She couldn't fight nature, but she could dance with it. The buffalo's weight, the wolf's agility, the ice's fragility. All these were pieces on a board she needed to learn to move. A daring plan began to form in her mind, a whisper of ancestral wisdom that seemed to come from the wind itself. If the ice was her enemy, it would also be her ally. She raised her spear, not in a gesture of attack, but as an extension of her will, her eyes fixed not on the buffalo or the wolves, but on the spreading cracks, on the thinner, more unstable areas of the frozen river. The price of the frozen promise would be high, but Amaya was ready to pay it with every fiber of her being. She took a deep breath, the icy air filling her lungs with renewed courage. The battle had barely even begun. Amaya took a calculated step, not towards the buffalo, but towards an area of ice that seemed slightly thinner, near a crack that stretched like a dry riverbed. The buffalo, with its colossal mass, grunted, interpreting the movement as a direct challenge. Its bloodshot eyes fixed on her, and it lowered its head, scraping its front hooves on the ice with a force that made the surface tremble. The wolves, in turn, watched with cold intelligence, their bodies tense, ready for any opportunity. With the spear firmly gripped, Amaya began to move in a slow semicircle, drawing the buffalo's attention. She neither ran nor showed fear, only a silent determination that seemed to defy the landscape itself. Each step was deliberate, part of a dangerous dance. The buffalo followed her, its fury growing, and the weight of its 5,000 kilograms began to test the limits of the ice. Deeper cracks appeared, accompanied by frightening creaks. Amaya felt her heart pound, but the image of her hungry son was a shield against panic. She pointed the spear at the buffalo, not to wound, but to provoke. The metal tip gleamed under the pale light. The buffalo roared, a guttural sound that made the air vibrate, and charged. Amaya rolled to the side at the last instant, feeling the wind from its horn brush past her face. The animal's impact against the ice was devastating. A new and enormous crack opened, spreading rapidly towards the semicircle of wolves. They retreated a little, instinctively, but hunger kept them close. Amaya knew she needed to be bolder. She stood up, breathless, and ran towards an area where the ice seemed more fragile, a spot she had observed before, near a small, snow-covered rocky elevation. The wolves, seeing her move, let out sharper howls, and some began to move, trying to intercept her. The buffalo, blind with rage, didn't notice the change in tactics and continued to pursue her, its heavy hooves pounding the ice. "Come, beasts!" Amaya whispered, her voice hoarse but filled with a courage she didn't know she possessed. She was using herself as bait, luring both the buffalo and the wolves to the breaking point. Her mother's wisdom echoed in her mind. Strength lies in knowing where the ground gives way. She leaped over the original crack, using the spear for support, and landed on the other side, turning to face the approaching avalanche of fury. The buffalo was a few meters away, its red eyes fixed on her. Behind it, the wolves approached, their steps silent and coordinated. Amaya saw the exact moment the buffalo stepped onto the most fragile area. The ice groaned, a sharp, prolonged sound, and then, with a deafening crash, it gave way. The 5,000-kilogram colossus partially sank, its front hooves trapped in the icy water, the fury in its eyes transforming into panic. The wolves, who were about to attack Amaya, were caught by surprise. Some fell into the smaller cracks that opened in a cascade. The buffalo, struggling to free itself, began to thrash, its massive horns swinging dangerously. It was chaos. Amaya, with her heart in her throat, knew this was the moment. She couldn't hesitate. With a cry that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, she advanced, her husband's spear raised, not against the buffalo, but against the horde of wolves, now trapped between the giant animal's fury and the ice that continued to give way. She used the spear to push the wolves closest to the buffalo, forcing them nearer to the struggling animal. The buffalo, in its agony and confusion, began to react to the approaching wolves, its horns and hooves becoming deadly weapons amidst the disintegrating ice. Amaya watched, her breath held, as nature took its course, a brutal spectacle of survival where the strongest and the most cunning would fight to the end. She had turned the battlefield into a trap, and now she merely awaited the outcome, trusting in the wisdom that had guided her thus far. The buffalo, its front hooves trapped and its heavy body struggling against the ice and frigid water, bellowed in panic. Its massive horns whipped through the air, striking the surrounding ice and making it crack further. The wolves, hungry and opportunistic, saw the giant's weakness. Though wary of the buffalo's fury, the sight of the promised meat was irresistible. Amaya, spear at the ready, didn't attack, but directed. She used the tip of the weapon to ward off the wolves, attempting to flank the buffalo, pushing them forward into the reach of the colossus's desperate horns. It was a deadly dance, a ballet of instincts and cunning. The buffalo, in its panic blindness, didn't distinguish between the predators and the woman who had cornered it. It fought against everything. Against the ice that trapped it, against the water that exhausted it, against the wolves that surrounded it. Its hooves struck forcefully, kicking up shards of ice, and its horns, in wide, disordered movements, hit the air and, at times, the boulder wolves that came too close. The ice beneath Amaya's feet groaned incessantly, each crack a warning. She felt the vibration of the battle through her boots, a tremor that climbed her legs and settled in her chest. The buffalo, exhausted, began to lessen the intensity of its movements. Its breathing was heavy, and the vapor it exhaled seemed weaker. The wolves, sensing its exhaustion, grew bolder, their howls now more confident. They didn't need a direct charge. Amaya's strategy was clear. Let nature do its work. The buffalo's weight, the cold water, the constant pressure from the wolves, all of it was wearing it down. Suddenly, with a last desperate effort, the buffalo tried to rise, but its hind legs, already weakened and slippery, gave way. The giant fell with a dull thud, not into the water but onto a vast sheet of ice that stretched like an unstable bridge. The impact was tremendous. Amaya, who was very close, felt the ground give way beneath her own feet. A deep and treacherous crack, which she hadn't noticed in the intensity of the moment, opened right in front of her. She tried to retreat, but it was too late. The ice beneath her cracked with a dry, frightening sound. Amaya fell, not into the water, but into a narrow, dark crevice, her body sliding downwards. Her husband's spear slipped from her hands, embedding itself in the edge of the ice but out of reach. A sharp piece of ice, dislodged in the fall, tore her left arm, and a sharp pain made her gasp. Trapped in the crevice, with the ice walls pressing in on her, Amaya looked up. The buffalo lay, exhausted and immobilized on the surface, the wolves cautiously approaching. The frozen promise now seemed more distant than ever, but the image of her son and the hungry elders ignited a flame of fury and determination in her eyes. She couldn't fail. Not now. Amaya felt the impact of the fall, the air expelled from her lungs in a muffled groan. The pain in her left arm was searing, an icy fire spreading rapidly. Trapped in the narrow crevice, the rough ice scraped her back and legs, and the intense cold of that natural prison seemed to drain her very life. She looked up at the faint opening that showed the grey sky and, for an instant, the outline of the fallen buffalo and the slender shadows of the wolves moving cautiously. Despair threatened to swallow her, a silent scream caught in her throat. But then the image of her son's hungry face, the hopeful gaze of the elders, and the solemn promise made to her dying mother, burned in her mind, stronger than the pain or the cold. Never let your people perish. Those words, a sacred oath, were now her anchor, her unwavering strength. She couldn't give in, not after everything. With a sigh that seemed to tear through her chest, Amaya began to test the ice walls with her right hand, the only one free and without serious injury. The ice was smooth and treacherous, but there were small ledges, tiny, almost imperceptible fissures that she could use. Her mother had always taught her to observe, to find weakness in strength, opportunity in adversity. With her left arm hanging uselessly, Amaya braced her legs against one of the walls, seeking leverage. The pain was excruciating, but she transformed it into fuel, into a constant reminder of what was at stake. Each movement was slow, calculated, a battle against gravity and her own body. Up above, the wolves, with their ancestral cunning, began to approach the buffalo. The giant lay motionless, its hooves still trapped in the crevice, its body heavy and exhausted. The low guttural howls were now a chorus of anticipation. They scented victory, the meat that meant the survival of their own pack. A bolder wolf, with dark fur and piercing eyes, stepped forward, testing the air, ready for the first attack. The opportunity Amaya had created was materializing, but she needed to be there to reap the rewards. With superhuman effort, Amaya managed to wedge the tip of her boot into the crevice and propel herself upwards. The ice gave way slightly, and she slipped, a cry of frustration escaping her lips. The pain in her arm intensified, but rage, a cold and determined rage, propelled her. She was not just a woman. She was the guardian of her people, the embodiment of a promise. She would not be broken. Amaya tried again, this time using the brute force of her right shoulder against the opposite wall, while her right hand desperately sought any purchase. Her fingers found a small indentation, and she pulled, feeling her muscles groan. Slowly, inch by inch, she began to drag herself out of the crevice. The effort was immense, each breath a gasp of agony. Her face was contorted, but her eyes held the flame of determination. Finally, with a last, desperate push, Amaya managed to hoist her upper body out of the crevice. She rolled to the side, falling heavily onto the ice. Breathless and exhausted, her injured arm throbbing mercilessly. The icy air whipped her face, but she was out. Raising her head, she saw the wolves, now closer to the buffalo, some already gnawing at the edges of the ice that held it. Her husband's spear, which had slipped in the fall, was a few meters away. With her jaw locked by pain and sheer willpower, Amaya crawled to the spear. Her fingers closed around the familiar shaft, a thread of hope amidst the chaos. She stood up, swaying, her body trembling, but her eyes fixed on the wolves. The buffalo was down, but the final battle wasn't over. The promise still echoed, and Amaya, wounded and exhausted, was ready to honor it until her last breath. The pain in her left arm throbbed with a pulsating intensity, each heartbeat sending waves of agony through her limbs. The cold seemed to penetrate her bones, but adrenaline and determination were a warm cloak that enveloped her. She gripped the spear shaft, feeling the familiar weight of her husband's weapon, an extension of her own will. The wolves, now in a tighter semicircle around the immobilized buffalo, watched her with a mixture of caution and greed. Their eyes gleamed in the gloom, and their low, guttural howls had transformed into impatient snarls. The scent of fresh blood, though subtle, hung in the air, further stoking their predatory instinct. The buffalo lay there, a mountain of flesh and fur, exhausted, its hooves still trapped in the cracked ice, its breathing weak and erratic. It would move no more. Amaya knew she couldn't face 1,000 wolves. Her physical strength was at its limit, and her injured arm made her vulnerable. But she had her mother's wisdom, the cunning that had guided her thus far. "Fear is a weapon, Amaya," her mother had once said, "but courage is a shield." She raised the spear, not to attack, but to assert her presence. Her eyes swept across the pack, meeting the gaze of each wolf, conveying a clear message. This prey was hers. With a hoarse cry, which seemed to tear the last vestige of air from her lungs, Amaya advanced a step towards the buffalo, striking the spear's tip against the ice with a thud. The sound reverberated, and some wolves instinctively recoiled. She was not easy prey, nor was she willing to share. The buffalo was there, the trophy of her struggle, the hope of her village. She would not allow it to be stolen. The pack hesitated. They were many, but Amaya, alone and wounded, radiated an aura of danger that made them think twice. They had witnessed the giant's fall, the cunning of the woman who had cornered it. The instinct for survival, stronger than momentary hunger, began to speak louder. One by one, the younger, less daring wolves began to back away, their tails between their legs, disappearing into the intensifying blizzard's mist. The dark-furred wolf, The pack leader remained for a moment, its eyes fixed on Amaya's. There was respect in its gaze, a silent understanding that this woman was no ordinary prey. With a final snarl, almost a lament, it turned its back and followed its companions, disappearing into the shadows. The silence that followed was almost deafening, broken only by the wind and Amaya's heavy breathing. She knelt beside the buffalo, her right hand resting on its thick, icy fur. A solitary tear ran down her face, not of sadness, but of relief and gratitude. The animal, which had been her greatest threat, was now salvation. She felt the residual warmth of the buffalo's body, a life extinguishing itself to sustain others. It was the law of Yakutia, harsh and unforgiving, but just. Amaya looked up at the grey sky, a silent prayer on her lips. Her mother, her husband, her son, all were there, in her heart. The frozen promise had been fulfilled, but the work was far from over. Dragging a 5,000-kilogram buffalo back to the village, wounded and exhausted, would be the next challenge. She knew she would need all her strength, all her wisdom. But, looking at the buffalo, at the white expanse around her and at the spear in her hand, Amaya felt renewed strength. She had faced the impossible and won. Now it was time to bring the victory home. The biting wind of Yakutia seemed to mock her newfound determination. "Bring the victory home," she murmured, her voice hoarse, as she tried to push the buffalo with her right shoulder. The colossus didn't move an inch. The spear, now stuck in the ice beside it, looked like a toothpick next to that mountain of flesh. Amaya felt despair creep in again, a cold deeper than winter's. How to move 5,000 kilograms, alone, with an injured arm and an exhausted body. The image of her son, trembling with cold and hunger, flickered in her mind, and with it the excruciating pain of the promise. She couldn't fail. Amaya stepped back a little, her gaze sweeping the landscape. The ice was smooth and unforgiving. There was no sled, no ropes, no help in sight. Her eyes lingered on the spear, then on the cracks that still snaked across the frozen river, witnesses to the battle. "The ice is a mirror," she recalled her mother's words, "but it can also be a trap for those who don't respect it." Diju, what if the ice could be more than that? What if it could be a tool? A daring, almost insane idea began to form in her mind. She couldn't drag the buffalo, but perhaps she could make the ice drag it. Her husband's spear, so faithful in combat, could be used in a new way. With the sharp tip, Amaya began to strike the ice around the buffalo, not to break it randomly, but to sculpt it. She envisioned a path, a kind of deep, smooth track that could guide the animal's heavy body. Each blow sent a painful shock through her injured arm, but she persisted, her jaw locked. The work was slow, arduous, and the sound of the blows echoed in the silent vastness. She wasn't trying to lift the buffalo, nor even push it directly. Her intention was to create a channel, a gently sloping ramp, using the existing fissures in the ice as guides. If she could tilt the buffalo sideways and make it slide, even if only a few meters at a time, she could eventually reach the more solid riverbank. It was a plan that would require patience, precision, and a willpower that seemed inexhaustible. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the cold intensified, biting at her exposed skin. Amaya felt her toes and fingers grow numb, but she continued to work, her breath forming dense clouds in the air. She knew that night would bring even greater dangers, and that time was her enemy. But every chip of ice that broke off, every inch of track she carved, was a small step towards her people's salvation. She looked at the buffalo, then at the spear, and a faint but determined smile appeared on her cracked lips. The frozen promise would not be broken. With the ice track now partially formed, Amaya positioned herself behind the buffalo, her good arm braced against the gigantic body. She took a deep breath, concentrating every ounce of energy she had left. "Come on, my friend," she whispered, as if the animal could hear her. "Let's go home." With a desperate push, using her legs and right shoulder, she forced the buffalo to move. The ice, smooth and sculpted, responded. Slowly, with a deep groan and a sound of friction, the buffalo began to slide. First, just a few centimeters, then a meter, and then another. Amaya felt a wave of euphoria mixed with the sharp pain in her arm. She was succeeding. The buffalo, now a heavy sled, slid along the track she had created, a silent testament to her cunning. With each small advance, hope in her heart grew. The darkness of night already enveloped the landscape, but the light of Amaya's determination burned brighter than ever. She knew the journey would be long and exhausting, but the first step had been taken. With the first slide, a spark of hope ignited in Amaya's chest. But the reality of the task soon asserted itself with all its brutality. The buffalo was an inert mountain, and each meter gained demanded a strength she barely knew she possessed, a hidden reserve that emerged from the deepest part of her being. Her injured arm throbbed incessantly, a dull ache that turned sharp and searing with each sudden movement, as if ice knives pierced her from within. She leaned against the animal's right shoulder, pushing with her legs, her thigh muscles burning in protest, every fiber of her body crying out for rest. The sound of the ice groaning under the colossal weight was the only melody in that silent white desert, a constant reminder of the fragility of her path and the immensity of the challenge. The darkness of night deepened with each minute, and the first stars began to speckle the sky, tiny points of light in an ebony veil that stretched infinitely above her. The cold, already biting and merciless, became even crueler, gnawing at her exposed skin and penetrating her thick clothes. Amaya felt the icy air burn her lungs with each gasping breath, and her fingers, even inside her fur gloves, began to lose sensation, while an uncontrollable shiver ran down her spine. She needed to keep moving, not just to drag the buffalo, but to survive the very night that threatened to swallow her. The cold is a stealthy thief, her mother had taught on a distant winter night. It steals your strength, your mind, your will. Fight it with the warmth of your heart, with the memory of those you love. Amaya clung to that memory, visualizing her son's hungry face, the hopeful smile of the elders, the image of her village warm and fed. That vision was the warmth that propelled her, an inner flame that refused to be extinguished, stronger than any icy wind. She continued to sculpt the path with the spear, opening new fissures and deepening existing ones, creating a groove that served as a track for the buffalo's heavy body. It was ant-like work, slow, arduous, and repetitive, testing the limits of her patience. The ice at times proved stubborn and treacherous, and the spear tip slipped unexpectedly, causing her to lose her balance and almost fall into the dark cracks. Each stumble was a blow to her already exhausted energy, a reminder of the constant danger. The buffalo, with its massive body, seemed to gain weight with each meter, as if the earth itself held it back. Amaya stopped every few steps, breathless, bent over the spear that now served as a support, desperately trying to catch her breath. Her eyes, red and tired, swept the landscape, searching for a reference point, some indication of progress. But the white vastness seemed endless, and the riverbank, where the ice would be more solid and safe, was still far away, a distant promise. A new challenge arose, subtle at first, but soon revealing itself as a considerable obstacle. The ice, which had previously seemed smooth and uniform, began to present small elevations and undulations, as if the surface had been disturbed by invisible forces, hindering the buffalo's slide. It was as if the earth itself was conspiring against her, testing her determination with every step. Amaya had to use the spear not only to sculpt, but also to leverage, forcing the animal's body to overcome the small obstacles with redoubled effort. The groaning of the ice became sharper, almost a lament under the pressure. The pain in her left arm now radiated to her shoulder and neck, transforming into a constant, pulsating agony. She felt the wound throb beneath her clothes, a cruel reminder of her physical vulnerability. But the idea of giving up was unthinkable, a betrayal of her very essence. The promise, the oath to her mother, was a sacred burden she carried with every fiber of her being, heavier than the buffalo itself. She remembered the stories of her ancestors, told around the campfire on winter nights, of women who faced even harsher winters, who overcame challenges that seemed impossible for any human being. They didn't have the brute strength of men, but they had the resilience of the earth, the cunning of the fox, and the unwavering patience of the ice. Amaya was one of them, an heir to that lineage of silent warriors. With a renewed surge of determination, she positioned herself again, pushing with everything she had, her teeth clenched, her face contorted by the effort. The buffalo slid once more, a little faster this time, overcoming one of the elevations with a scraping sound. A small triumph, but significant. The riverbank was still a mirage in the growing darkness, but Amaya felt she was drawing closer, inch by inch. Every muscle ached, every bone protested, but the flame in her heart, the promise, guided her through the frozen night. She was not just a woman, she was the hope of her people, and that hope would never bend. The mirage of the riverbank, which had once seemed a distant promise, now transformed into an almost imperceptible point in the darkness that swallowed the landscape. Amaya knew she was drawing closer, but each meter seemed to demand the strength of a kilometer, a silent battle against the vastness and time. Hours stretched into a frozen eternity, and the sky, once speckled with stars, was now covered by a dense veil of heavy clouds, promising more snow. The moonlight, which at times offered faint solace, was completely obscured, leaving her in a world of deep shadows and oppressive silence. The buffalo, with its immense weight, seemed to have fused with the ice, resisting every push. Amaya's left arm, once merely sore, now pulsed with excruciating pain that radiated to her fingertips, making every movement a torture. She held it close to her body, trying to lessen the pressure, but the need to use her right shoulder to push the animal strained all adjacent muscles. Her breath came out in dense clouds, and her lungs burned with the frigid air. Her lips were cracked and dry, and thirst was a silent agony, but she couldn't stop. Every second was precious. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, a gentle whisper that mingled with the wind's howl. "Amaya, the spirit of winter is strong, but the spirit of our people is stronger. It resides in patience, cunning, and the flame that burns in your heart." That flame was the image of her son, his small, hungry face, the eyes of the elders, the solemn promise made to her mother. She wasn't just dragging a buffalo. She was carrying the hope of an entire village on her weary shoulders. With the spear, she continued to deepen the tracks, now more by instinct than by clear sight. Her fingers, stiffened by the cold, barely felt the wooden shaft, but muscle memory guided her. The ice, increasingly uneven, presented new fissures and small elevations that seemed to appear out of nowhere, like invisible traps in the darkness. Each time the buffalo got stuck, Amaya had to redouble her effort, using the spear as a lever, searching for the exact point of leverage to move the colossus. The groaning of the ice under the weight and pressure was a constant sound, a lament that seemed to come from the river itself. Fatigue was a thick fog that tried to obscure her mind, whispering for her to give up, to lie down and let the cold take her. But Amaya shook her head, pushing away these treacherous thoughts with a low, almost inaudible growl. "No," she thought. "I can't. I won't." She remembered the stories of her ancestors, told on winter nights around the campfire, of how they faced even harsher winters, of how the community united to overcome adversity. She was the guardian of that tradition, the continuation of a lineage of resilience that refused to be broken. Finally, after what felt like centuries of superhuman effort, the texture of the ice changed beneath her feet. The cracks became less deep, and the surface, though uneven, seemed more solid, indicating the proximity of the bank. Hope, which had dwindled to an almost extinguished ember, rekindled with a small flame in her chest. But when Amaya managed, with a last desperate push, to drag the buffalo out of the main riverbed to what should have been the safe bank, she was met with a new and disheartening obstacle. The bank was not a gentle ramp, but a steep elevation of compacted ice and snow, almost a vertical and imposing wall, rising more than 3 meters above her. The buffalo was now stuck at the base of this insurmountable wall, impossible to push up without help, a final barrier between her and the fulfilled promise. The wall of ice and snow, 3 meters high, loomed before Amaya like a final cruel mockery of winter. Her eyes, already blurred by fatigue and pain, swept the imposing barrier, and a heavy sigh escaped her cracked lips. It was as if, after climbing a mountain, she found herself facing an impassable abyss. The buffalo, an inert giant, lay there at the base, a trophy too heavy to be lifted, a salvation that suddenly seemed unattainable. Despair, which she had fought to keep at bay for so many hours, now threatened to swallow her whole, a cold even more penetrating than the environments. A solitary tear, warm for an instant, then freezing, ran down her cheek. "It can't be," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible, a lament lost in the wind's howl. The image of her son, with an empty stomach and eyes full of hope, rose in her mind, followed by the pale faces of the elders. The promise to her mother, etched in fire in her heart, now seemed a distant mirage. About to dissolve in the cruelty of that night, Amaya knelt in the snow, the spear plunged into the ice before her, serving as a support. Her entire body trembled, not just from cold, but from exhaustion and deep frustration. Her left arm pulsed with unbearable pain, and her right shoulder, which had borne the buffalo's weight for so long, was raw. She closed her eyes for a moment, searching within herself for the strength that seemed to have drained away. The spirit of winter is strong, but the spirit of our people is stronger. Her mother's voice resonated again, not as a whisper, but as a cry in her soul. She opened her eyes, and her gaze, though weary, began to search for a solution, a glimmer of hope in that desolate landscape. Pushing the buffalo upwards was impossible. Lifting 5,000 kilograms, alone and wounded, was madness. But her mother had also taught that the mountain can be circumvented if it cannot be climbed. Amaya stood up with difficulty, limping slightly, and began to walk along the base of the ice wall, spear in hand, her eyes scrutinizing every inch of the surface. The darkness was almost total, but the snow reflected some of the faint ambient light, allowing her to distinguish shapes. The wall seemed continuous, a natural fortress. But then, a few meters to her right, she noticed something. A fissure, wider and deeper than the others, stretched upwards, almost like a narrow path, though steep and treacherous. It wasn't a ramp, but perhaps a weak point, an opportunity. The idea that formed in her mind was even riskier than carving a track in the river ice. She couldn't push the buffalo up, but perhaps she could pull it. What if she could climb that fissure, tie the spear to the buffalo, and somehow use the animal's own weight, and the walls inclined to make it roll upwards, inch by inch? It would be a Herculean effort, but not impossible. With the spear, she began to test the solidity of the fissure, striking the icy surface. The sound was hollow in some spots, firmer in others. She would need footholds, steps to climb. Using the sharp tip of the spear, Amaya began to carve small indentations in the ice, one by one, like small holes for her feet and hands. It was meticulous and dangerous work, each strike of the spear sending painful vibrations through her injured arm. The fear that the ice would give way under her weight, or that she would slip and fall, was constant, but the promise was stronger. She climbed the first meter, then the second, her body tense, every muscle alert. The wind whipped her face and snow began to fall again, fine and biting, making visibility difficult. But Amaya didn't stop. She reached the top of the wall, breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. Up there, the terrain was flatter, covered by a layer of soft snow. She turned and looked down at the buffalo, which seemed even smaller in the darkness. The next step would be the hardest, pulling the giant upwards, against gravity, against exhaustion, against Yakutia itself. The frozen promise demanded one more test of her unwavering will. Amaya, at the top of the wall, felt the icy wind whip her face, but her mind was fixed on the colossus below. The buffalo lay, a dark mass at the base of the elevation, seeming even heavier and more immovable. The idea of pulling 5,000 kilograms alone, with an injured arm and an exhausted body, was absurd. But giving up was not an option. She took off the long strip of rawhide she used as a belt, an essential item for nomadic life, and with trembling but steady hands, began to tie it to the spear. The spear's tip, already plunged into the ice, would serve as a fulcrum. She needed leverage. With the other end of the belt, she carefully descended the fissure she had carved, her feet finding the small footholds she had created. With each descending step, the pain in her left arm intensified, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. Upon reaching the base, Amaya tied the belt firmly to one of the buffalo's hind legs, ensuring the knot was secure. She then climbed back up, her heart pounding in her chest, every muscle protesting. At the top, she gripped the spear, which was now attached to the buffalo by the belt. The idea was to use the spear as a rudimentary lever, pulling it back with all her weight and strength, hoping the buffalo would slide a few centimeters upwards. The first pull was a titanic effort. Amaya leaned back, her feet firmly planted on the ice, the muscles in her legs and right shoulder screaming. The belt stretched, the spear groaned under the tension, and the buffalo didn't move. A wave of icy despair washed over her. It was useless. She didn't have the necessary strength. Her eyes closed for an instant, and the image of her son, with his thin face and cracked lips, appeared with painful clarity. The promise, the promise. With a renewed breath, Amaya opened her eyes. She couldn't pull the buffalo directly upwards, but perhaps she could make it roll. The wall wasn't perfectly vertical, there was a slight incline. If she could unbalance the animal, make it pivot on its own axis, it might be able to climb the wall in a spiral. She descended again, untying the belt from the leg, and with the spear began to dig a small groove in the snow and ice beside the buffalo at the base of the wall. It wasn't to drag, but to create a point of support for the animal to roll. The work was slow, and the cold penetrated her clothes, but she persisted. Upon finishing the groove, Amaya tied the belt to the buffalo's upper body, near its neck, and climbed back up. This time, she wouldn't pull directly upwards. Instead, she pulled the spear sideways, trying to tilt the buffalo. The effort was immense, and the animal's body resisted. But slowly, with a scraping sound and a deep groan from the ice, the buffalo began to move. Not upwards, but sideways, rotating slightly. Amaya felt a pang of hope. She repeated the movement, pulling and tilting, and the buffalo rotated a little more. It was an agonizing process, inch by inch, but it was working. With each rotation, the buffalo climbed a little higher on the wall, using the groove as a guide and its own body as a lever. The ice beneath her feet at the top of the wall groaned, threatening to give way, and the spear, which served as a support, trembled in her hands. Snow fell harder now, and the wind howled, trying to drag her away. But Amaya didn't yield. Sweat ran down her forehead, mixing with tears and freezing on her face. Her muscles burned, and the pain in her arm was a constant flame. She remembered her mother's stories about the winter dances, where hunters used cunning to overcome brute force. She was dancing with Winter, and the buffalo was her partner. With a last desperate effort, a hoarse cry escaping her lips, Amaya pulled the spear with all the strength she had left. The buffalo, with a dull thud, rolled over the edge of the wall, falling heavily into the soft snow at the top. Amaya released the spear, which fell beside her, and collapsed into the snow, breathless, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had succeeded. The giant was at the top. The promise, though not yet fully fulfilled, was closer than ever to being honored. Exhaustion overwhelmed her, but a faint smile of pure victory appeared on her frozen face. Amaya, collapsed in the snow, felt her body tremble uncontrollably, but a strange warmth coming from the deepest part of her soul began to spread. It wasn't the warmth of fire, but that of victory, of the promise almost fulfilled. She had moved the mountain. The buffalo lay there, a sleeping giant, irrefutable proof of her resilience. With a sigh that seemed to come from another world, she turned onto her side, propping herself on her elbow, and looked at the animal. Her tear-filled eyes, once filled with pain and despair, now gleamed with a faint light of triumph. The pain in her left arm was still excruciating, but it seemed distant, muffled by the grandeur of the moment. She knew the journey wasn't over. The buffalo was at the top of the bank, but the village was still a long and arduous distance away. Snow continued to fall, and the icy wind offered no respite. But now, with each flake that touched her face, Amaya felt a new surge of strength. Her ancestors had taught that winter was not an enemy to be defeated, but a master to be understood. Slowly, with an effort that seemed to tear every fiber from her being, Amaya stood up. She picked up the spear, which lay beside her, and used it as a third support. Her right leg, the pillar of her effort, was stiff and sore, but she forced it to move. She needed a plan to drag the buffalo through the deep snow. Pushing would be impossible. Pulling with the belt and the spear was the only option. She tied the belt again, this time around the buffalo's neck, creating a kind of harness. With the spear, she began to dig a path in the snow, compacting it, creating a firmer track for the animal's heavy body. It wasn't quick work, but methodical. Each step was an act of faith, each pull a silent prayer. She didn't think of the pain nor the cold, only of the image of her son, so vivid she could almost feel his embrace. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, the notion of time lost in the white vastness. Amaya pulled, stopped, dug, pulled again. The sun began to rise on the horizon, a pale and distant disk, but one that brought with it the promise of a new day. The faint light revealed the landscape, and Amaya could see in the distance the small plumes of smoke rising from the village chimneys. A wave of emotion washed over her, and a warm tear ran down her face, mixing with sweat and ice. With a final effort, she pulled the buffalo closer. The first houses of the village were visible now, small dark specks in the white immensity. The sight gave her renewed strength. She was no longer alone. The village was there, waiting for her promise. When Amaya finally dragged the buffalo to the village entrance, the sun was already higher, casting a golden glow over the snow. The village dogs, who had sensed her approach, began to bark, and soon the doors of the yurts opened. First, an elder, then another, and then the women and children. An astonished silence fell upon everyone as they saw the colossus of ice and flesh, and Amaya covered in snow and sweat, the spear still in her hands, her arm injured and hanging. Her son, small and thin, ran towards her, his eyes wide with surprise and joy. Amaya dropped the spear and knelt, opening her arms. He threw himself into her, and she hugged him with the strength she had left, feeling the warmth of his small body. Tears flowed freely now, not from pain, but from relief and love. The elders approached, their faces marked by time, but their eyes full of admiration and gratitude. They said nothing, merely touched her shoulder with reverence, a gesture worth more than 1,000 words. The promise was fulfilled. The village was saved. Amaya, the indomitable guardian, had brought life back to the frozen heart of Yakutia. The silence, broken only by the dog's barking, soon gave way to a murmur of astonishment, which transformed into exclamations of relief and gratitude. The women, with tear-filled eyes, covered their mouths with their hands, while the men, previously overcome by hopelessness, now approached the buffalo with a mixture of reverence and admiration. That colossus, which seemed a mountain of flesh and hide, was the answer to their silent prayers, proof that winter had not won. Little Kyle, still clinging to his mother, felt the warmth of her body, the scent of snow and effort, and the strong beat of her heart. He lifted his face, his childlike eyes meeting hers. "Mama," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Amaya smiled, a tired smile but overflowing with love, and kissed her son's forehead. In that embrace lay the entire meaning of her journey, the reason for every pain, every step. The elders, with the wisdom of many springs, wasted no time. With firm gestures, they began to organize the younger men for the task of butchering the buffalo. The meat would be cut into thin strips to dry in the icy wind, ensuring food for weeks, perhaps months. The hide would be treated, offering warmth and protection. Nothing would be wasted. The buffalo's spirit would be honored and its gift celebrated. While the men busied themselves with the hunt, the village women approached Amaya. Old Anya, with her wrinkled but gentle hands, touched Amaya's injured arm. "Come, child. You've done more than any of us could dream." They guided her into a yurt where a fire crackled, offering welcome warmth. Amaya felt her body relax as she sat on soft furs. The women carefully removed her frozen clothes, revealing her wounds and abrasions. Her left arm was swollen and bruised, but didn't seem broken. Anya applied healing herbs and a reindeer fat ointment, murmuring ancient healing songs. While being cared for, Amaya watched her son's face, who was now by the fire, eating a piece of dried meat someone had offered him. He ate eagerly, but his eyes still sought hers, an unbreakable bond of trust and love. The image of her mother, with her serene and wise face, rose in her mind. "Never let your people perish." The promise was fulfilled, not just with the strength of her arms, but with the resilience of her spirit, with the cunning that Yakutia had taught her. That night, the village celebrated. It wasn't a noisy celebration, but a feast of gratitude and relief. The smell of roasted meat filled the air, and the children's laughter, once rare, echoed through the yurts. Amaya, though still sore, sat among the elders, her son nestled beside her. She was no longer just a hunter's widow. She was Amaya, the guardian, the woman who defied winter and brought life back. The days that followed brought healing to Amaya's body and hope to the village's heart. The buffalo meat ensured that no one went hungry. The hides offered shelter and warmth. The community, once on the brink of despair, now united with a new purpose, inspired by Amaya's feat. Winter was still harsh, but it no longer seemed so invincible. Amaya, with her arm recovering, watched the children play in the snow, their faces rosy and full of life. She had fulfilled her promise, not just to her mother, but to each of them. The flame in her heart, the flame of life and resilience, burned stronger than ever. She was living proof that even in the frozen heart of Yakutia, the strength of an indomitable spirit could move mountains, or, in this case, a 5,000-kilogram buffalo, ensuring that life would always find a way. The village would prosper, and Amaya's story would be told for generations, a beacon of hope and courage in the frozen vastness. Months turned into seasons, and seasons into years. Winter, though still relentless in its icy beauty, never again seemed so threatening. The village, once shrunken under the weight of hunger and despair, flourished. The yurts were repaired with new hides, The herds slowly began to recover in the sheltered pastures, and the children with rosy faces and free laughter ran and played in the snow, a sound that, for a long time, had been silenced by fear and uncertainty. Amaya's story, the woman who defied winter and brought the 5,000-kilogram buffalo, was not just told. It was lived in every act of kindness, in every gesture of sharing. She became the legend whispered around campfires, the song sung by mothers to soothe their children, the silent and powerful example that the strength of the human spirit could move mountains of ice and flesh. Amaya was no longer just the widow. She was the mother of the promise, the guardian of life, a beacon of hope for all. Her arm, completely healed, bore the scars like maps of an epic journey, marks of an arduous victory, and her eyes, once marked by pain and worry, now gleamed with a deep serenity, the wisdom of one who had faced the abyss and returned with salvation. She didn't seek praise, but accepted the respect and reverence of her people with the humility of one who understands the weight and honor of her responsibility. The elders, who once viewed her with concern and a certain skepticism, now consulted her for every important decision, valuing her keen intuition and her unwavering connection to ancestral wisdom. Kyle, her son, grew strong and curious, with an insatiable thirst for knowledge. He had his mother's eyes, full of a calm and observant intelligence, and the same silent determination that had driven her. Amaya taught him about the stars that guided the nomads, about the treacherous paths of the wind, about how to read tracks in the snow, and above all, about the non-negotiable importance of honoring life and community with every fiber of his being. He listened to the stories of the buffalo and the 1,000 wolves with a gleam in his eyes, not as tales of unattainable bravery, but as lessons of courage and cunning that one day he too should embody to protect his people. Amaya saw in him the seed of a promising future, the living continuation of her promise. The village, inspired by Amaya's feat, developed a new and profound form of cooperation and solidarity. Hunts became collective endeavors where strategy, coordination, and equitable sharing were valued more than individual strength. The women united to care for the most vulnerable, to weave warmer and more resistant clothes, to prepare food in a way that would last longer without waste. Winter continued to test them with its sudden blizzards and biting frosts. But hunger, that terrible shadow that once lurked, had receded, replaced by a sense of security. They learned that true wealth was not in material abundance, but in the ability to unite, to adapt, and to find solutions where before they only saw despair. Amaya often sat by the edge of the ice river, the same one that had almost swallowed her in its dark crevice. She observed the cracks, the intricate ice formations, and felt the silent, comforting presence of her mother, the voice that had guided her in her darkest and most desperate moments. The frozen promise was no longer a heavy burden, but a precious legacy, a beacon that illuminated the path for future generations, a testament of faith. She had proven that life, even in the coldest heart of Yakutia, was a flame that, once lit by hope and unwavering determination, would never be extinguished. Amaya's village was not just a point on the map. It was a living testament to human resilience, a sanctuary of hope and warmth against the relentless vastness of winter. With each sunrise that painted the horizon golden, with each child's laughter that echoed in the pure air, with each smoke plume rising from the yurts, Amaya's promise was renewed, weaving itself into the very fabric of her people's existence. She was the guardian, the mother, the living legend, and her story, an eternal echo that love, courage, and unity could indeed defy the frozen world and bring spring to the soul forever.